There was a frozen bar that tasted like nothing else on the truck. Not chocolate, not strawberry, something quieter than that. A crunchy almond coating that shattered the moment your teeth broke through, and underneath it, cold vanilla cream that hit the back of your throat like the first real day of summer. At its peak, that bar was in every good humor truck rolling through every suburb in America. Kids lined up at the curb with quarters sweating in their fists. Families stacked the multi-packs 3 deep in the freezer. It was the bar you didn't have to think about. You just asked for it every single summer for 50 years. Then one day in 2022, the shelf space was gone. No farewell, no announcement on the 6 o'clock news. Just an empty slot in the frozen foods aisle where something beloved used to live. How does a taste that defined the American summer for half a century simply disappear without a word? This is that story. And if you grew up reaching for that white wrapper on a hot afternoon, this one belongs to you. It started with a stick. In the summer of 1920, a candy maker named Harry Burt was running a small confectionery shop in Youngstown, Ohio. He had already invented one thing worth remembering, a lollipop he called the Good Humor Sucker, a hard candy on a wooden stick so children could eat it without getting their hands sticky. But Burt was thinking bigger. He had been experimenting with a chocolate-coated ice cream bar, and the taste was right, but the problem was the same one every parent in America already knew. Ice cream made a mess. It dripped, it smeared. It ended arguments about whether kids could eat it in the car. His daughter took one bite of the new chocolate bar and said it tasted good. His son pointed out the obvious solution. Put it on a stick, the way the lollipop worked. Burt filed the patent in 1920. By 1921, he had outfitted a fleet of refrigerated trucks with bells, dressed his drivers in white uniforms to signal cleanliness, and sent them rolling through the neighborhoods of Youngstown with a simple promise. Ice cream you could hold in your hand, sold by a man who looked like he worked in a hospital. The idea worked immediately. The trucks spread. Within a decade, Good Humor had franchised operations in cities across the Midwest and East Coast, and the white truck with the bell had become one of the most recognizable sounds of the American summer, as reliable as a lawnmower on Saturday morning or a screen door slamming shut in the heat. But the Toasted Almond Bar came later, and it came from a different kind of thinking. By the time Good Humor was building out its full product lineup through the 1940s and 1950s, the company understood something important about the people lining up at the truck window. Not everyone wanted chocolate. Chocolate was safe. Chocolate was expected. But there was a segment of the American public that wanted something with a little more texture, a little more sophistication, without crossing into anything that felt fancy or expensive. These were working families in the suburbs that were exploding across post-war America. They wanted a treat that felt considered without feeling indulgent. The Toasted Almond Bar answered that exactly. The formula was straightforward in concept and precise in execution. A center of vanilla-flavored frozen dairy dessert surrounded by an almond-flavored coating and rolled in a crust of toasted almond crumbs that gave the bar its defining characteristic. That dry, nutty snap on the very first bite that no other bar in the lineup could replicate. The almond flavor was not sharp or bitter. It was warm. It was the kind of flavor that felt familiar even the first time you tasted it. Like something your grandmother might have baked on a Sunday afternoon translated into something cold and portable and perfect for July. The timing could not have been better chosen. The 1950s and 1960s were the golden age of the American suburb, and the suburb was the natural habitat of the Good Humor truck. Streets full of children with nowhere particular to be on a summer afternoon. Mothers watching from porches. The distant sound of that bell coming around the corner. In the scramble for change on the kitchen counter. The Toasted Almond Bar fit into that world without effort. It was price for a child's allowance, size for a child's hand, and complex enough in flavor that adults reached for it too. Somewhere in a Good Humor test kitchen, sometime in those post-war decades, someone pulled a bar off a production line, took a bite through that almond crust, felt the cold vanilla underneath, and understood that they had made something people would come back for. They were right. For the next 50 years, they were exactly right. If you were a child in America between 1965 and 1995, there's a good chance the Toasted Almond Bar was part of your summer the same way fireflies were, or the smell of cut grass, or the particular boredom of a Tuesday afternoon in August with nowhere to go and nothing to do except listen for that bell. The good humor truck had a language of its own. Every neighborhood knew it. The bell started faint, 2 or 3 blocks away, and by the time it rounded the corner, the sidewalk was already filling up, kids on bikes dropping them in the grass without bothering to lay them down properly, younger children running in that uncoordinated full-body way that only children under 10 years old can manage, older kids trying to look casual while moving faster than they intended. The truck would stop, the window would slide open, and the decision had to be made. There was always a decision. The strawberry shortcake bar was pink and obvious. The chocolate eclair was safe and familiar. But the toasted almond bar occupied a different position. It was the choice of a kid who had tried the others and arrived at something more specific, more personal. You didn't grab a toasted almond bar by accident. You knew what you wanted, and you wanted that crust. The bar came out of the truck wrapped in a thin white paper sleeve printed with a good humor name in red and blue. The unwrapping was its own ritual. You peeled it back carefully because the almond crumbs on the outside had a tendency to cling to the paper, and losing even a few of them before the first bite felt like a small injustice. The coating was dry and sandy in texture, not greasy, not sticky. Toasted almond crumbs pressed firmly enough into the surface that they held together through the wrapper and the first few bites before beginning to fall in a gentle cascade into your hand or onto the sidewalk. The vanilla center was smooth and cold and quiet in flavor, content to let the almond do the work. Together, the two components created something that rewarded patience. The bar did not give up all of its pleasure in the first bite. It deepened as you went. By the 1970s, the toasted almond bar had also made the move from the truck to the supermarket freezer case. And this is where a second generation of its life began. The multi-pack box, white with the Good Humor logo, stacked in the frozen foods aisle alongside the popsicles and the creamsicles and the fudgesicles, meant that the bar was no longer something you had to wait for. It lived in your freezer. It was available on a Wednesday night after dinner when nobody was going anywhere. It was the thing your mother handed you through the back door when the day had been long and the house was hot and she needed 5 more minutes of quiet. What was it about that bar that made it feel like yours and no one else's? Part of it was the flavor profile. Almond was specific in a way that chocolate never had to be. You either sought it out or you didn't. And if you did, it felt like a preference that said something about you. Part of it was the texture, that contrast between the crunch on the outside and the give on the inside, which rewarded each bite slightly differently depending on how much coating remained. And part of it was simply repetition. The way a thing eaten every summer for a decade stops being a product and becomes a landmark, a fixed point in the geography of a childhood. The people who worked the Good Humor trucks in those decades remember the toasted almond bar as a consistent performer, not the best seller on the truck, but the most loyal one, meaning the people who ordered it almost never ordered anything else. In the language of consumer behavior that would be described as brand loyalty, on a hot street in suburban Ohio or New Jersey or Georgia in 1978, it looked like a 10-year-old who already knew exactly what she wanted before the truck had finished stopping. Fan communities that have formed in the years since the bar's discontinuation overflow with the specific texture of these memories. One commenter on a Facebook group dedicated to bringing the bar back wrote that the toasted almond was the only thing he and his father ever agreed on. Every Friday evening in the summer, his father would flag down the truck and order 2 of them without asking, because there was no need to ask. A woman in a Reddit thread described driving 40 minutes out of her way in 2021 to a grocery store that someone had reported still had a box in stock, buying 4 boxes, and keeping one in the freezer for 6 months before finally opening it. Not because she was saving it, because she wasn't ready for it to be the last one. These are not the responses of people who merely liked a product. These are the responses of people who understood, even if they never said it in these words, that the toasted almond bar was holding something in place for them. A season, a version of themselves, a relationship that no longer existed in any other form. The bar was at its widest cultural reach through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, available in Good Humor multi-packs at Kroger, Safeway, A&P, and Winn-Dixie locations from coast to coast, still riding the trucks through the neighborhoods each summer, still wrapped in that white paper that came apart in the heat if you weren't careful. It was everywhere. And because it was everywhere, nobody thought to worry about the day it wouldn't be. That day was coming. But in the summer of 1983, standing on a sidewalk in the afternoon shade with a Toasted Almond Bar in one hand and change left over in the other, there was no reason on earth to believe that anything about this would ever change. The Good Humor truck was a beautiful business model until it wasn't. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the truck was everything. The distribution channel, the marketing campaign, and the customer experience all rolled into one white vehicle with a bell. You didn't need a television ad if your product came to the customer's front door every summer afternoon. You didn't need shelf placement negotiations with supermarket buyers if the buyer was a 9-year-old standing at the curb. The truck was simple, direct, and deeply personal in a way that no freezer aisle could replicate. But by the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the economics of the truck were beginning to strain. Labor costs were rising. Fuel was more expensive. The suburbs were spreading outward faster than routes could follow them, and the new subdivisions being built at the edges of American cities were designed around cars, not foot traffic. Wider streets, fewer sidewalks, longer distances between houses that made the old neighborhood route less efficient with every passing year. The truck was not disappearing, but it was no longer sufficient on its own. Good Humor had already begun its move into supermarkets before these pressures peaked, but the shift accelerated through the 1970s as the company recognized that the freezer aisle offered something the truck never could: year-round availability, consistent volume, and access to the growing number of American households doing their weekly shopping at the large suburban supermarkets that were themselves expanding rapidly during this period. The multi-pack format was the key. A family that bought a box of 12 Toasted Almond Bars at Kroger on Saturday was buying convenience, predictability, and a freezer stocked against the requests of children for the entire week ahead. The supermarket deals required a different kind of selling entirely. Instead of a driver with a bell, Good Humor now needed sales representatives negotiating with regional grocery buyers, arguing for freezer case real estate in a category that was becoming more crowded every year. Popsicle was there, Klondike was growing, store-brand frozen novelties were beginning to appear at lower price points. The freezer case in a 1970s Kroger was already a competitive environment, and getting a multi-pack product onto the shelf and keeping it there required consistent sales velocity that justified the space it occupied. The Toasted Almond Bar earned its place. It was not the category leader, but it was a reliable performer with a loyal customer base that supermarket buyers understood had real repeat purchase behavior. People who bought the Toasted Almond Bar came back for it. That kind of predictable demand was exactly what a grocery buyer wanted to see when deciding whether to reorder. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the bar reached what would become its widest geographic distribution, available in supermarket chains across all regions of the country, still present on the summer trucks, and occupying a stable position in the Good Humor lineup that showed no sign of vulnerability. The factory production lines were running. The white boxes were moving. The bar had successfully made the transition from a neighborhood ice cream truck novelty to a genuine national supermarket product without losing the core of what made it worth buying in the first place. Then in 1994, everything above it changed. Unilever, the Anglo-Dutch consumer goods conglomerate that by the early 1990s had become one of the largest food and personal care companies in the world, acquired the Good Humor Breyers ice cream business from Kraft General Foods. The deal was substantial, folding Good Humor into a portfolio that already included Breyers, Klondike, Popsicle, and Ben & Jerry's, among others. From a pure scale standpoint, the acquisition made the Good Humor brand part of one of the most powerful frozen dessert distribution networks ever assembled in the United States. The trucks, the supermarket relationships, the brand recognition, all of it now sat inside a company with the resources to take it anywhere. But scale cuts in two directions. Inside a conglomerate managing dozens of ice cream brands and hundreds of individual SKUs, every product has to justify its existence in terms that a spreadsheet can evaluate. Market share, margin contribution, production complexity relative to revenue generated. The Toasted Almond Bar, with its specific almond crumb coating that required its own production handling, its loyal but not explosive sales numbers, and its positioning in a mid-tier price range that was neither premium nor aggressively budget-priced, now had to prove its worth inside a system that was measuring everything simultaneously. In 1994, it was still proving it. The brand equity was real. The consumer loyalty was documented. The bar kept its place in the lineup and kept moving through the supermarket freezer cases that Unilever's distribution network could now service with greater efficiency than Good Humor had ever managed alone. But the context had shifted in a way that would matter enormously in the years ahead. The Toasted Almond Bar was no longer the product of a company whose entire identity was built around ice cream trucks and summer afternoons. It was now one item in a portfolio of hundreds, managed by executives in offices far from any suburban sidewalk, evaluated by metrics that had nothing to do with the sound of a bell coming around the corner. That distance, between the people who made the decisions and the people who ate the bar, would prove to be the longest distance of all. There is a particular kind of product that stops being a product somewhere along the way and becomes a given. Not a luxury, not a treat you have to plan for or seek out, just a thing that is always there, the way the mustard is always in the back of the refrigerator door, or the way a particular chair always faces the same direction in the living room. You stop noticing it until the day it isn't there anymore, and then you notice it all at once. The Toasted Almond Bar became that kind of given for a generation of American families sometime in the late 1970s, and it held that position for the better part of 2 decades. By the mid-1980s, the bar was available in Good Humor multi-packs at virtually every major supermarket chain operating in the United States. Kroger carried it, Safeway carried it, A&P carried it across its northeastern stronghold, Winn-Dixie carried it through the South. The white box with the red and blue Good Humor logo was a fixture in the frozen foods aisle, the way certain things simply become fixtures. Not because of aggressive marketing or a particularly memorable campaign in any given year, but because of accumulated presence, year after year, season after season, in the same spot on the same shelf, in the same store, where the same families did the same weekly shopping. The trucks were still running too. Through the 1980s and into the early 1990s, the Good Humor truck remained a presence in American suburbs, and the Toasted Almond Bar remained one of its most consistent sellers. This meant the bar was reaching consumers through two entirely different channels simultaneously: the planned purchase in the supermarket and the impulsive one at the curb, which is the kind of market saturation that most food brands spend enormous resources trying to engineer, and that Good Humor had achieved in the case of this particular bar, largely by showing up reliably for long enough that people stopped imagining summer without it. The television advertising of this era did not treat the Toasted Almond Bar as the star of its own campaign the way some products command their own dedicated spots. Good Humor's advertising through the 1970s and 1980s tended to sell the truck, the experience, the white uniform and the bell, and the feeling of summer itself. And the Toasted Almond Bar was part of that feeling without needing to be named every time. It appeared in the lineup shots, the quick cuts of children's hands reaching for paper-wrapped bars at the truck window. It didn't need a jingle. It had something more durable than a jingle. It had repetition, and repetition across decades is a more powerful force in consumer memory than any 30-second spot ever broadcast. When did a frozen bar stop being just a frozen bar and become the taste of a whole season? The answer is different for every person who ate one, but the mechanism is always the same. Enough summers in a row until the bar and the summer become inseparable in memory, until reaching for one is the same gesture as reaching for the other. The generational transmission of the bar during this period is worth pausing on. The parents who first bought Toasted Almond Bars from Good Humor trucks in the late 1950s and 1960s were, by the 1980s, the parents buying the multi-packs at Kroger and stacking them in the garage freezer. Their children, The ones growing up in those 1980s suburbs, the ones who would eventually become the Facebook group members and Reddit commenters of the 2020s, were eating the same bar their parents had eaten, in a different format, in a different decade, but with the same coating and the same cold vanilla center that had not meaningfully changed since the bar first appeared in the lineup. There was a continuity to it that felt accidental, but was in fact the product of a company that had not yet found a reason to alter something that was working. The factory workers who ran the Toasted Almond Bar production lines during the peak years describe a product that was straightforward in its construction, but demanding in its consistency. The almond crumb coating had to be applied at a precise point in the freezing process. Too early, and the crumbs sank into the surface. Too late, and they didn't adhere properly. The temperature controls had to be exact. The vanilla center had to be the right density to hold the stick without cracking during the coating process. It was, by the standards of industrial frozen dessert production, a bar that required attention. The people who made it knew what they were making, and they made it the same way every time, because the customers who bought it would have noticed immediately if they hadn't. That consistency, in the product, in the distribution, in the quiet, seasonal reliability of finding it exactly where you expected to find it, was the deepest source of the bar's hold on the people who loved it. It never surprised you. It never disappointed you. It was simply, summer after summer, exactly what it had always been. In the food industry, that kind of stability is supposed to be the foundation you build on forever. What it turned out to be in this case was the last thing to go. The shopper in 1998 who reached into the freezer case at her local Kroger and pulled out a box of Good Humor toasted almond bars had no reason to think anything was wrong. The box looked the same. The bar inside looked the same. The price was reasonable. She put it in the cart the way she always did, drove home the way she always did, and stacked the box in the garage freezer next to the popsicles without giving it another thought. What she could not have known, what none of the people buying the bar through the late 1990s and early 2000s could have known, was that the world the bar lived in was quietly becoming a more difficult place to survive. The first pressure was structural, and it had been building since the Unilever acquisition in 1994. Inside a portfolio that now included Breyers, Klondike, Popsicle, Haagen-Dazs, and Ben & Jerry's, the Good Humor brand occupied a specific and increasingly complicated position. It was the classic American novelty line. The truck bars, the summer staples, the products that carried enormous nostalgia value, but not the kind of premium pricing that drove the margins Unilever needed from its ice cream division. Ben & Jerry's could charge $4 more per pint, and consumers would pay it without flinching because the brand had built a story around its product that justified the price. Haagen-Dazs bars were positioned as an adult indulgence, a small luxury, something you bought for yourself rather than for the children. Good Humor was neither of those things. It was accessible, affordable, and beloved. Three qualities that are genuinely valuable to consumers and genuinely difficult to monetize at the scale a company the size of Unilever required. The Toasted Almond Bar, specifically, carried an additional complication that the simpler bars in the lineup did not. The almond crumb coating was not a cheap component to produce. California almond prices, which had been relatively stable through the 1980s, began a long-term upward trend in the late 1990s and accelerated sharply through the 2000s as global demand for almonds grew, and the California crop, which supplied the majority of the world's almonds, became subject to the kind of supply volatility that commodity markets produce. A bar whose defining characteristic was a coating of toasted almond crumbs was, from a cost of goods standpoint, more exposed to that volatility than a bar whose coating was chocolate or a simple sugar glaze. Every time almond prices moved, the margin on the Toasted Almond Bar moved with them in the wrong direction. The second pressure came from the market itself, and it arrived from two directions at once. From the premium end, the category was changing. Through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, the frozen novelty aisle was being reshaped by products that offered more. More chocolate, more sophisticated flavor combinations, more of a sense that you were treating yourself to something worth the calories. The Magnum bar, which Unilever itself owned, was built on exactly this proposition. A thick Belgian chocolate coating, a rich ice cream center, and packaging and advertising that positioned it as an adult pleasure rather than a children's snack. Magnum was growing. It was growing fast. And inside Unilever's own planning meetings, the resources and the marketing attention were following that growth. From the value end, private label frozen novelties were improving. The store brand almond bars and vanilla bars sitting 2 shelves below the Good Humor multi-pack in the freezer case were getting better in quality and more aggressive in price. And for a consumer who was not specifically loyal to the Good Humor name, the gap between them and the branded product was narrowing in ways that were visible at the register. The Toasted Almond Bar was caught between these two forces without a clear answer to either one. It could not match Magnum on premium positioning because its price point and its brand identity were built around accessibility. It could not match the private label on price without destroying its own margins further. It was, in the language of competitive strategy, being squeezed from both sides. And the squeeze was happening slowly enough that no single quarterly report made it look like a crisis. How many times can a company quietly shrink a product's world before the people who love it notice it's already gone? The answer, as it turned out, was many more times than anyone who loved the bar would have found acceptable. Through the mid-2000s, distribution of the Toasted Almond Bar began to contract in ways that were not announced and not obvious to any individual consumer, but were visible in aggregate. Certain regional chains stopped reordering. Certain markets where the bar had been a consistent seller saw the multi-pack disappear from the planogram, the diagram that determines exactly which products go where in a retail freezer case, replaced by something with better velocity numbers or a stronger promotional arrangement with the retailer. A consumer in one city might still find the bar easily at her regular supermarket, while a consumer 3 states away was already making do without it and had been for a year or more, without fully registering the absence. This is how products begin to die in the modern grocery system. Not with a press release or a final production run marked in anyone's calendar, but with a series of small contractions, each one individually invisible, collectively fatal. The bar was losing ground. The people inside Unilever who were tracking the numbers knew it. The regional sales representatives who were fielding calls from grocery buyers knew it. The consumers who loved the bar did not know it yet because they were still finding it often enough that the gaps felt like coincidence rather than pattern. But a store manager in suburban Atlanta who had stocked the Good Humor Toasted Almond multi-pack every summer for 15 years noticed, sometime around 2008, that his reorders were coming back short more often than they used to. He didn't think much of it the first time. Supply chain issues happened. The second time, he called his distributor. The third time, he moved something else into the space and made a note in the back of his mind that the Toasted Almond Bar might not always be something he could count on. He was more right than he knew. There is a particular kind of corporate decision that looks entirely reasonable from the inside and devastating from the outside. And the decisions that ended the Good Humor Toasted Almond Bar were exactly that kind. To understand them, it helps to understand what Unilever was managing by the mid-2000s. The company's ice cream division, operating under the umbrella brand name Walls in most of the world, and through its American portfolio of Good Humor, Breyers, Klondike, Popsicle, Haagen-Dazs, and Ben & Jerry's, was one of the largest ice cream businesses on earth. The scale was genuinely staggering. Hundreds of individual products across dozens of brands, manufactured in multiple facilities, distributed through a supply chain of extraordinary complexity, competing in a category that was simultaneously growing at the premium end and being pressured at the value end by private label alternatives that were improving every year. At that scale, the way you manage a portfolio is not by thinking about individual products one at a time. You think in tiers. You identify your growth drivers, the products gaining share, the brands with pricing power, the lines that consumers are actively trading up to, and you put your resources there. You identify your stable performers, the products holding their position, generating reliable cash flow, not growing but not declining in ways that require intervention, and you maintain them with minimal investment. And then at the bottom of the analysis, you identify the products that are consuming production capacity, distribution attention, and marketing resources at a rate that is not justified by the revenue and margin they return. Those products, in the language of portfolio management, are candidates for rationalization. Rationalization is the word the industry uses. It is a clean word for a thing that is not clean at all. The Toasted Almond Bar had been drifting toward the rationalization category for years before the final decision was made. Its production requirements were more demanding than the simpler bars in the lineup. The almond crumb coating process required handling that a chocolate dip bar did not, which meant dedicated line time and quality control attention that added cost without adding scale. Its price point sat in a middle range that was neither low enough to compete on value nor high enough to support the kind of margin that Unilever needed from the products it was actively investing in. Its sales velocity, while loyal in the specific sense that repeat purchasers came back reliably, was not growing in the way that justified keeping it at the front of the freezer case in a retail environment where every inch of space was being evaluated by the retailer's own category management systems. None of these facts, taken individually, would have been enough to end the bar. Products survive worse positions than this all the time, particularly when they carry the kind of brand equity and consumer goodwill that the Toasted Almond Bar had built over 5 decades. What they did collectively was make the bar vulnerable in a way it had never been before. Vulnerable to the next round of portfolio review, the next restructuring initiative, the next strategic conversation about where Unilever wanted its ice cream division to be in 5 years, and which products were not part of that picture. And who exactly was supposed to protect the people who had been buying this bar for 50 years when that conversation happened? The answer, as it turned out, was nobody. Not because the people inside Unilever were indifferent to consumer loyalty. They were not. But because consumer loyalty to a mid-tier SKU in a legacy product line is not the kind of data point that carries decisive weight in a portfolio rationalization meeting. What carries weight is margin. What carries weight is growth trajectory. What carries weight is whether the production capacity currently allocated to the Toasted Almond Bar could be redeployed to a product that would generate more return on the same investment. The bar could not win that argument. It never had a chance to make it. The people who felt the consequences of these decisions most directly were not the executives who made them. They were the workers on the production lines, the regional sales representatives, and the independent ice cream truck operators who had built their summer businesses around the Good Humor lineup for decades. The production facilities that handled Good Humor novelty bars were not small operations. The Green Bay, Wisconsin plant that served as one of Unilever's primary frozen novelty manufacturing sites was a significant employer in its community, the kind of facility that anchors a local economy in the specific way that a large food manufacturer can. Steady work, union wages, benefits, the kind of employment that allowed working families to buy houses and send children to college, and build the kind of stability that a manufacturing job in mid-century America had promised and for a long time delivered. When Unilever began consolidating its manufacturing footprint through the 2000s and 2010s, closing facilities, shifting production, optimizing the network for efficiency at the expense of redundancy, the human cost of those decisions was distributed across communities that had no voice in the boardroom conversations that produced them. The regional sales representatives who had spent careers selling the Good Humor lineup to grocery buyers across their territories understood the bar's vulnerability before most consumers did. They were the ones sitting across the table from category managers at regional grocery chains, being told that the Toasted Almond Bar's velocity numbers were no longer sufficient to justify the freezer case real estate it occupied, that the planogram was being revised, that something with a stronger promotional program or a better margin structure would be taking its slot. They carried that information back to their managers and filed their reports, and the reports confirmed what the spreadsheets already showed, and the spreadsheets informed the decisions that the people at the top of the organization were already inclined to make. The independent ice cream truck operators were perhaps the most quietly affected of all. By the 2010s, the classic Good Humor truck model, company-owned vehicles, uniformed drivers, defined neighborhood routes, had largely given way to a franchise and independent operator system in which individual entrepreneurs purchased the right to sell Good Humor products from their own trucks on their own routes. These operators had built their menus around the products that their customers asked for by name, and the Toasted Almond Bar was reliably on that list. When Unilever began reducing the bar's availability through the mid-2010s, pulling back distribution in certain markets, these operators found themselves telling longtime customers that the bar was out of stock, then that it was temporarily unavailable, then that they weren't sure when it was coming back. It was an uncomfortable conversation to have repeatedly, and it eroded something that was difficult to quantify but real: the trust that comes from being able to deliver, summer after summer, exactly what your customers expect. The formal discontinuation came in 2022. Unilever, in the process of a broader portfolio review that affected multiple Good Humor products, confirmed that the Toasted Almond Bar would no longer be produced. The company cited changing consumer preferences, a phrase that does real work in these announcements, covering a range of actual causes behind the clean surface of its language. Changing consumer preferences. As though the people who had been buying the bar for 50 years had collectively decided on their own that they no longer wanted it. As though the decision had been made by the market rather than in a meeting room. There was no farewell campaign, no limited edition final run packaged in commemorative wrappers the way some brands choose to mark the end of something beloved. No acknowledgement in any public communication from Unilever that what was being discontinued was not merely a SKU, but a 50-year relationship with millions of American consumers who had never been given any reason to expect it would end. The bar simply stopped being made. The production lines that had turned out toasted almond bars through the summer seasons of 5 consecutive decades went quiet. The boxes stopped arriving at distribution centers. The reorders stopped being fulfilled. And in freezer cases from Maine to California, the space where the Good Humor Toasted Almond multi-pack had lived for 30 years was filled with something else, something that had better velocity numbers and a cleaner margin profile, and no history whatsoever with the people standing in the aisle staring at it. The decisions that ended the Toasted Almond Bar were not made by villains. They were made by professionals doing the job they were hired to do, applying the logic of modern portfolio management to a product that could not survive that logic's conclusions. That is, in some ways, the most honest and the most troubling thing that can be said about what happened. The bar was not killed by malice. It was killed by a system that was working exactly as designed, a system that had no room in its calculations for the specific weight of a summer memory, for the particular value of a taste that a person has carried since childhood, for the irreplaceable quality of something that has simply always been there. Those things do not appear on a spreadsheet. They never did. And in 2022, for the last time, that absence made all the difference. The first sign was not an announcement. It was an absence. Sometime in the spring of 2022, shoppers in certain markets across the United States began reaching into the freezer case at their regular supermarket and finding that the Good Humor Toasted Almond Bar multi-pack was not where it was supposed to be, not moved to a different shelf, not temporarily out of stock with a paper tag promising restocking by a certain date. Simply gone. The space it had occupied filled by something else, or left empty in the way that freezer cases sometimes look when a planogram change has not yet been fully executed and the new product has not yet arrived to cover the gap. Most of these shoppers assumed it was a supply chain issue. The early 2020s had conditioned American consumers to expect disruptions. Empty shelves had become a familiar enough sight during the pandemic years that a missing multi-pack registered as an inconvenience rather than a warning. People made a note to check again next week. Some of them checked a different store. A few of them, the ones whose relationship with the bar went back the longest, felt something slightly more uncomfortable than inconvenience. A small, specific unease that they could not entirely account for and did not yet have a name for. The confirmation came in pieces. A customer service inquiry to Unilever returned a form response acknowledging that the product had been discontinued. A food industry trade publication noted the discontinuation as part of a brief item about Good Humor portfolio changes, and then, as happens in the internet age with any product that carries real consumer loyalty, the news spread through the communities that cared about it with a speed and an emotional intensity that surprised people who had not been paying attention to how many people cared. The Facebook group dedicated to bringing back the Good Humor Toasted Almond Bar, which had existed for years as a low-activity gathering place for nostalgic consumers, suddenly filled with posts. People who had not logged into Facebook in months came back specifically to register their reaction. The post followed a recognizable pattern: disbelief first, then confirmation seeking, then grief, then anger, then the particular kind of resigned sadness that comes when you understand that the thing you have lost is genuinely not coming back. A petition on change.org calling on Unilever to reverse the decision gathered thousands of signatures within days of the news spreading, the signatories leaving comments that read less like consumer feedback and more like testimonials. Descriptions of childhood summers, of fathers and daughters, of the specific ritual of the white wrapper on a hot afternoon, of the feeling of reaching into the freezer case on a Wednesday evening and knowing exactly what you were going to find. One commenter wrote that she had eaten a toasted almond bar every summer since she was 6 years old. She was 53 when she wrote the comment. That was 47 summers. She did not know what to do with the 48th. Unilever did not reverse the decision. The company had made portfolio rationalization choices of this kind before and understood that the initial consumer reaction to a discontinuation, however intense, tends to dissipate over time as people find alternatives or simply adjust to the absence. This is statistically true. It is also, in the specific case of a product that has occupied the same place in someone's life for 47 summers, a description of loss that the word adjustment does not adequately cover. The online secondary market responded to the discontinuation with the particular logic of scarcity. Listings appeared on eBay for remaining boxes of Good Humor toasted almond bars. New old stock pulled from the back of freezers, bought out from stores that still had inventory, sourced from distributors clearing the last of their supply. The prices were not modest. Boxes that had retailed for $5 or $6 at Kroger were selling for $20, $30, $40 from sellers who understood that for certain buyers, the question was not whether the price was reasonable, but whether the thing was available at all. Some buyers purchased multiple boxes and stored them, extending the supply as long as the freezer would allow, in full knowledge that they were rationing something that could not be replenished. A candy and novelty food collector in Ohio documented his purchase of the last available case he could locate. 12 boxes, sourced from 3 different sellers across 2 states, and posted about it in a food nostalgia forum with a photograph of the boxes stacked in his chest freezer. The comments on his post were not envious. They were elegiac. People thanked him for preserving something, as though the boxes in his freezer were the last copies of a book that was going out of print. The media coverage that followed the discontinuation was modest by the standards of a major news cycle, but significant by the standards of a frozen novelty bar. Food-focused publications ran items on it. Local television news stations in markets where good humor had deep roots picked up the story. The angle was always the same: a reporter standing in a supermarket freezer aisle, gesturing at the space where the bar used to be, interviewing a shopper in her 50s who said something honest and unscripted about what it felt like to lose a thing she had never thought to worry about losing. The Today Show mentioned it. Food and Wine covered the fan reaction. None of the coverage was extensive. All of it captured the same essential thing: that the people who loved this bar loved it in a way that went beyond preference, and that the loss of it had activated something in them that a purely rational accounting of the situation could not explain. What the media coverage could not fully capture, because it moved too quickly and required a story with a beginning and an end and a usable quote, was the texture of the loss as it was experienced by the people who had been buying the bar the longest. Consider a man in his late 50s living in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. He has been buying Good Humor toasted almond bars since his mother first handed him one through the back door of their house on a summer evening in 1974. He is not a person who thinks of himself as particularly sentimental about food. He does not collect vintage packaging or participate in nostalgia forums or follow food history accounts on social media. He is a practical person who eats practical food and does not spend much time thinking about why he likes what he likes. But every summer, without making a conscious decision about it, he buys a box of toasted almond bars at the Kroger near his house and works through them over the course of July and August. One in the evening after the dinner dishes are done, standing at the counter or sitting on the back steps if the night is warm enough. It is not a ritual he has named. It is simply something he does. In the summer of 2022, he goes to Kroger, and the box is not there. He checks two more stores. Neither of them has it. He looks it up on his phone in the parking lot and finds the news. He sits in his car for a moment longer than he needs to before starting the engine. He does not post about it on Facebook. He does not sign the petition. He does not buy boxes on eBay. He drives home without the bar and does not entirely understand, for several days afterward, why the absence stays with him the way it does, why it surfaces at odd moments, why it feels less like losing a product and more like losing a version of a season that he had not realized he was still in. What filled the space on the shelf where the Toasted Almond Bar had lived was, in the specific Kroger where this man shopped, a multi-pack of a competing brand's vanilla and almond novelty bar, a product that was not bad, that was reasonably priced, that fulfilled the basic functional requirements of a frozen bar in a multi-pack format. He bought it once. It tasted fine. He did not buy it again. The ice cream truck operators who had carried the Toasted Almond Bar through their summer seasons faced a version of this same problem at a different scale. The bar had been a menu item that customers asked for by name, sometimes by name only. Not, do you have any almond bars, but specifically, do you have the Good Humor Toasted Almond? When operators began telling customers in the summer of 2022 that they no longer carried it, that it was no longer being made, the reactions they encountered ran the same spectrum the online communities had already documented. Disbelief, then sadness, then a kind of quiet acceptance that the operators found in some cases harder to witness than the anger would have been. Acceptance meant the customer had already understood that asking again next summer would not change the answer. By the end of the summer of 2022, the Good Humor Toasted Almond Bar had effectively ceased to exist in the American market. The last boxes had sold through or been purchased by collectors. The production lines that had made it were running other products. The freezer case space it had occupied for 30 years had been reassigned and restocked, and the planograms had been updated, and the category management systems had moved on to the next set of decisions about the next set of products. The summer continued. It always does. Children still lined up at ice cream trucks and still reached into freezer cases and still unwrapped cold bars on hot afternoons. The ritual persisted even as the specific thing that had been part of it for so many people was gone. But somewhere in a suburb of Columbus, and in a suburb of Atlanta, and in a suburb of Portland and Phoenix and Pittsburgh, and every other American city where a Good Humor truck had once rolled through the neighborhood with its bell ringing in the summer heat, there was a person who opened a freezer door in July and felt, for just a moment, the specific weight of something that used to be there and wasn't anymore. That feeling does not have a product name. It does not appear in any market research report. It is simply what it is. The moment when a small, reliable piece of the world goes missing, and the world closes over the gap so quickly and so completely that you begin to wonder, after a while, whether anyone else even noticed it was gone. They noticed, they all noticed, and they have not forgotten. The shelf moved on. It always does. Within weeks of the Toasted Almond Bar's disappearance from the Good Humor lineup, the freezer case space it had occupied was filled, restocked, and planogrammed with products that had better velocity numbers and cleaner margin profiles and no particular relationship with anyone's childhood. The grocery system does not mourn, it optimizes. The gap closed, and to a shopper who had never bought a Toasted Almond Bar in their life, there was nothing in the frozen foods aisle of any American supermarket in the summer of 2022 that indicated anything had been lost at all. But in the communities where the memory of the bar lived, the response to its absence was not acceptance. It was ingenuity. Within months of the discontinuation, homemade copycat recipes began appearing across food blogs, YouTube channels, and TikTok with a frequency and a seriousness of purpose that said something important about the depth of the loss. These were not casual attempts, not a home cook improvising with what was in the pantry and calling it close enough. These were methodical reconstructions, people who had eaten the bar for decades, applying genuine effort to the problem of replicating a specific flavor and texture profile from memory and ingredient logic. The vanilla center was achievable. A good vanilla ice cream base, the right fat content, the right freezing temperature, that part could be solved. The almond-flavored coating was harder, requiring a precise combination of almond extract concentration and fat carrier that varied enough between attempts to generate lengthy comment thread debates about which formulation came closest. The toasted almond crumb exterior was the hardest of all. The crumbs had to be the right grind, toasted to the right color, applied at the right moment in the freezing process to adhere without sinking, and the result had to produce that specific dry, sandy snap on the first bite that anyone who had eaten the original bar could identify immediately as either right or not quite right. Nobody got it exactly right. This is the nature of industrial food production at scale. The precise combination of ingredients, equipment, temperature controls, and process timing that produces a specific result cannot be fully replicated in a home kitchen or a small commercial operation, no matter how skilled or determined the person attempting it. The copycat recipes produced things that were good, sometimes very good, occasionally good enough that the person making them felt a complicated emotion that was part satisfaction and part grief. Satisfaction at having gotten close, grief at the reminder of how far away close actually was. What does it mean for a culture when the taste that defined its summers can be erased by a spreadsheet decision in a corporate headquarters 3,000 miles away? The question does not have a comfortable answer, but the Toasted Almond Bar's aftermath points toward one part of it. What the bar's discontinuation revealed, in the intensity of the response it generated, was the degree to which certain mass-produced food products had embedded themselves in American life, at a level that the companies producing them had never fully measured, and could not, therefore, fully account for when making decisions about their futures. Unilever tracked the bar's sales velocity. It tracked its margin contribution and its production costs and its retail placement metrics. What it could not track, what no spreadsheet in any portfolio management system has ever been designed to capture, was the specific emotional weight the bar carried for the people who had been buying it since childhood, the role it played in the rituals and relationships and seasonal rhythms of millions of American lives. That weight is real. The aftermath of the Toasted Almond Bar's discontinuation is evidence that it is real. Petitions, Facebook groups, eBay bidding wars, 47 summer testimonials, men sitting in parking lots looking things up on their phones and feeling something they cannot name. These are not the responses of people reacting to the loss of a commodity. They are the responses of people who have lost something that was doing work in their lives that they had never stopped to examine because they had never needed to. The broader food industry lesson written into this story is one that the industry has encountered before and will encounter again, because the economic logic that produces these decisions has not changed and will not change as long as large conglomerates manage portfolios of hundreds of products against margin and growth targets that have no line item for memory. Small products with loyal audiences and complicated production requirements will always be vulnerable in that system. They will always look from a certain angle and at a certain scale, like problems to be solved rather than relationships to be honored. What replaced the Toasted Almond Bar in the market was nothing specific and everything general. A category full of frozen novelties that are competently made and appropriately priced and entirely without the particular history that made one bar in one white wrapper mean something to the people who reach for it summer after summer for 50 years. The trucks still roll in some neighborhoods when summer comes. The bells still ring. Children still run toward the sound with money in their hands and decisions to make at the window. But there is one answer they can no longer give, and the person who used to give it without thinking, who never imagined a summer when that answer would not be available, is still out there somewhere, opening a freezer door in July and making do with what is there instead of what used to be. There was a sound that came before it. That is the thing people remember first, before the taste, before the wrapper, before anything else. The bell. Faint at first, 2 or 3 blocks away, then closer, then close enough that you were already moving toward the door before you had consciously decided to. The truck would round the corner and the afternoon would reorganize itself around that fact, the way afternoons in childhood have a capacity to reorganize themselves that afternoons in adulthood have mostly lost. Everything that had been happening stopped. Everything that mattered was now at the curb. You knew what you wanted before you got there. That was part of it. The specific certainty of knowing, out of everything on the truck, out of everything in the freezer case at Kroger, out of everything that summer had to offer in the way of cold and sweet, that the one you wanted was the one with the almond crust, the one that felt like a choice you had made yourself, not a default, not the obvious one. You handed over your quarter or your dollar, and the bar came back wrapped in white paper that was already softening slightly at the edges from the heat, and you peeled it back carefully because the crumbs on the outside were precious in a way that was completely out of proportion to their size and entirely reasonable, given what they were. The first bite was always the best one. That dry, sandy snap of toasted almond giving way to the cold vanilla underneath. A combination so specific that it occupied its own place in the flavor memory. A place nothing before or since has managed to fill. Not because nothing else is good, because nothing else is that. The taste was not complicated in the way that food critics use that word. It was complicated in the way that a place from childhood is complicated, layered with everything that happened there, inseparable from the context that gave it meaning, impossible to fully explain to someone who was not present for the original experience. This is what the Toasted Almond Bar provided that no nutritional label ever captured and no portfolio review ever measured. It provided a fixed point. In the long, loose geography of an American childhood, the summers that blurred together, the neighborhoods that changed, the families that shifted and strained and reorganized themselves around the pressures that families absorb. The bar was a constant. It was there the summer your parents were happy, and there the summer they weren't. It was there the year you were too old for the truck and started buying the multi-pack yourself, and felt in that small transaction something that resembled growing up. It was there when you bought it for your own children and watched them do with it what you had done, the careful unwrapping, the first bite, the crumbs falling into the hand, and understood without needing to say it that you were handing them something that went beyond the thing itself. That is what working-class American food culture at its best has always done, and what the people who condescend toward it have always failed to understand. The food was never just the food. The TV dinner eaten in front of the 6 o'clock news was never just convenience. It was a working mother's act of provision, the table she could set after a full day of work, the meal that said, I am here and I fed you, and that is enough, and it is. The cereal eaten on a Saturday morning in front of cartoons was never just breakfast. It was sovereignty, a child's hour before the day made its demands, sweet and unsupervised and entirely their own. And the frozen bar unwrapped at the curb on a summer afternoon was never just a frozen bar. It was the afternoon itself, the permission to be nowhere and want nothing except the thing already in your hand. The people who made the Toasted Almond Bar, the food scientists who formulated it, the production line workers who ran the coding process summer after summer with the precision it required, the drivers in white uniforms who handed it through truck windows to children who already knew what they were going to order. They made something that outlasted the math that was eventually used to end it. The bar generated loyalty that no focus group designed and no marketing campaign engineered. It generated it the old way, the only way that actually works, by being exactly what it was, consistently, for long enough that people stopped being able to imagine summer without it. That is the thing that is gone. Not a SKU, not a production line, not a slot in a freezer case planogram, a taste that was woven into the fabric of ordinary American life so thoroughly and for so long that millions of people carried it without knowing they were carrying it. The way you carry the particular smell of a house you grew up in, or the sound of a voice that no longer answers when you call. Somewhere tonight, someone is trying to describe that first bite to a person who never tasted it. They are reaching for the words, the crunch, the cold, the almond, the summer, and the words keep arriving slightly short of the thing itself, the way words always do when the thing they are reaching for is gone. That is what was lost. Not a product, a taste that was only ever possible once, in a particular time, in a particular country, on a particular kind of afternoon, that also no longer exists in quite the same way. It was enough. It was more than enough. And it deserved better than silence.